Everyone, before we begin this Tuesday morning briefing, I want to formally address an organizational restructuring. Our senior account handler for client relations here is no longer with Apex Group as of today. We are moving in a different strategic direction with someone whose personal profile better aligns with our long-term corporate vision. Those words echoed across the main fourth floor gathering space from the mouth of Director Karen Thornton on a crisp Tuesday morning in early September. 29 corporate employees stood around the glass-enclosed atrium, suddenly taking an intense interest in their polished marble floor tiles, their coffee cups, or their personal fingernails. Anyone except me. I stood quietly near the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a heavy blue folder containing 5 years of comprehensive client retention, revenue architecture, and partnership growth metrics. 5 full years of labor. 5 years of systematically transforming 15 struggling, failing corporate client relationships into 118 thriving, highly lucrative long-term accounts that kept Apex Group financially afloat. Karen maintained that rehearsed executive smile, the specific artificial expression she deployed whenever she wanted to sound collaborative while enforcing an absolute unilateral decree. She looked directly at me and requested that I pack my personal desk items by 5 o'clock that evening, explaining that the company needed my workspace, cleared for a newly recruited senior associate starting the following Monday. I remember standing there at 54 years old, feeling how remarkably steady my legs remained under the weight of her sudden announcement. My hands did not tremble, nor did I drop those detailed performance reports across the floor. I simply gave a measured nod and walked back toward my corner desk without uttering a single vocal complaint. Behind my back, hushed whispering immediately erupted among the staff. Karen seamlessly transitioned into reviewing quarterly margin targets, as though she had not just publicly erased a dedicated senior professional in front of everyone who had watched him build the company's core client base. 5 years earlier, I had walked into Apex Group with a distinct personal objective. 3 months prior to submitting my formal application, my late father, George Vance, had sat me down in his study and revealed something that profoundly altered my perspective. He explained that a decade earlier he had served as a primary angel investor for Apex Group, injecting substantial equity capital when the firm was struggling to survive. He held a 35% equity stake in Apex Group, while Chief Executive Officer Julian Moss held 55% and small private shareholders held the remaining 10%. However, my father demanded a binding personal vow before I ever stepped foot inside their offices. He insisted that I start at the absolute bottom of the organization as a junior account executive, never disclosing my surname connection or his equity holdings to anyone. He told me that if I leveraged his reputation or ownership capital, I would never truly know if my achievements were earned or granted out of obligation. I gave him my word that I would remain completely silent, competing fairly as an ordinary professional, building his career purely on personal capability. My father passed away 3 years into my tenure at Apex Group following a sudden pulmonary illness that deteriorated rapidly. I worked continuously through the dark days after his memorial service because immersing myself in client management was the only way I knew to process grief. 6 months later, my younger sister Maya Vance required urgent major abdominal surgery. I managed her hospital visits while working late nights and weekends, ensuring our major corporate partners experienced no disruption in service. Over the previous 18 months, I had spent almost every Saturday and Sunday in my office reviewing account histories, auditing contract structures, and analyzing client retention models. I did not do this because management coerced me, but because I wanted to fulfill my father's memory and prove to myself that his faith in my independence was entirely justified. Karen Thornton knew nothing about my father's equity or my family legacy. To her, and the rest of the executive committee, I was merely Nathan Vance, a quiet senior account handler who had somehow stumbled into extraordinary luck with key clients. Somehow was the favorite word Karen utilized whenever discussing my performance metrics. She would casually remark during management reviews that Nathan somehow managed to prevent major clients from departing, or that Nathan somehow secured expanded service contracts across the entire Midwest region, as if 5 years of relentless relationship building was merely the result of accidental good fortune. 3 weeks before that fateful Tuesday morning announcement, Karen had summoned me into her executive office. She informed me that a prominent international private equity group was preparing a comprehensive audit to potentially acquire Apex Group in a multi-million-dollar buyout deal. She instructed me to condense all 5 years of my proprietary relationship management frameworks, client retention algorithms, and strategic growth blueprints into an exhaustive master presentation deck. I dedicated 85 exhausting hours over the next 4 weeks to synthesizing every operational model I had engineered. I detailed how we converted 15 failing client contracts into 118 thriving corporate relationships, creating a standardized account management framework that secured long-term stability. Now, following her public declaration, I stood in my office area packing my personal belongings into 2 cardboard boxes. I carefully packed a small desk Fern Maya had given me, a framed photograph of our family taken before my father passed away, my reference books on contract law and corporate strategy, and a ceramic coffee mug from a former colleague. My entire 5 years of dedicated corporate labor fit into 2 ordinary boxes. Sarah Drake, a senior account representative who had worked alongside me for 4 years, walked over with tears welling in her eyes. She stated furiously that this decision was an absolute outrage, reminding me that I had built over half of the firm's sustainable revenue base. I quietly told Sarah that it was fine, and that corporate environments sometimes operated this way, but she insisted I should challenge the termination with CEO Julian Moss, who owned 55% of the firm and ought to know who actually generated the company's profits. Julian Moss barely knew my name or face. To him, I was simply an operational line item working in the background. I told Sarah that contesting her decision was futile and that I would simply move forward with my life. Before I departed that afternoon, Sarah and several other long-term employees embraced me, expressing deep gratitude for the support I had provided them over the years. They knew the truth of what I had accomplished, but none of them possessed the executive authority to overturn Karen Thornton's decision. I carried my 2 boxes to my car and drove home to my apartment, where I sat at my dining table staring at the packed items. My personal phone rang multiple times with calls from major corporate clients seeking guidance on their accounts, but I did not answer. The accounts were no longer my responsibility. By the next morning, Karen would reassign those relationships to her newly appointed management favorites, who would attempt to inherit the trust I had painstakingly cultivated over 5 years of dedicated labor. My sister Maya came over to my apartment later that evening. The moment she saw the packed cardboard boxes resting on the floor, her expression shifted from concern to intense anger. She brewed a pot of tea and sat opposite me, her voice dropping into a stern, measured tone as she listened to me describe how Karen Thornton had publicly announced my departure. Maya reminded me of the immense sacrifices I had made over the preceding 5 years, including working straight through our father's funeral arrangements and missing personal milestones to manage urgent corporate crises for Apex Group. She argued that the executive team had treated me like an interchangeable asset despite my foundational contributions to the firm's commercial growth. While her frustration was entirely justified, I recognized that emotional indignation would not alter the corporate reality. Karen had executed her maneuver, and Julian Moss would inevitably accept whatever narrative Karen presented regarding my performance and operational fit. The private equity acquisition team was scheduled to conduct their final formal evaluation in 26 days on the 9th of October. Karen intended to present all 85 hours of my strategic work product as her own visionary leadership, securing her position and a massive executive bonus upon completion of the corporate buyout. However, as I reviewed the circumstances surrounding my departure over the following days, I identified a critical oversight in Karen's execution. In her haste to publicly distance me from the firm, Karen had completely failed to issue formal written notice of termination, severance documentation, or official HR departure paperwork. as mandated under state employment statutes and federal guidelines, such as the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. Because no formal severance agreement had been executed or processed through human resources, I remained legally listed as an active senior account handler in Apex Group's enterprise databases. My corporate credentials, building security access, and administrative network privileges remained fully active. My name continued to appear on internal organizational charts and active client assignment logs. Karen had staged a public performance of firing me, yet had neglected the fundamental legal and administrative procedures required to terminate an employee. This administrative negligence presented a unique legal dimension. Under Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code, original written frameworks, strategic documentation, and proprietary analytical models created during employment carry strict legal protections regarding authorship and intellectual property attribution, especially when corporate officers attempt to misappropriate individual work product for personal financial gain during an institutional buyout. Furthermore, corporate officers owe a strict breach of fiduciary duty to shareholders not to misrepresent operational assets or executive oversight during acquisition audits. As the 9th of October approached, I monitored the shared corporate planning repositories that Karen had forgotten to revoke my access from. I observed her entire presentation deck taking shape. Every single strategic client retention framework, every revenue growth methodology, and every account recovery process I had engineered over 85 hours was fully incorporated into her master deck. However, my name had been completely excised from the documentation. Karen had systematically replaced every reference to my individual work with her own executive title, portraying 5 years of my labor as her personal strategic vision. She had scheduled a 2-hour presentation before the Private Equity Evaluation Committee, intending to demonstrate that Apex Group's expansion from 15 to 118 key accounts was driven entirely by her managerial brilliance. I could have quietly walked away, accepted a modest job offer elsewhere, and allowed the acquisition to proceed based on Karen's fraudulent documentation. I had sworn a solemn promise to my late father that I would build my career independently without relying on his equity ownership or business connections. Revealing the truth to the board would require breaking my silent vow and invoking his memory to confront executive misconduct. Yet, allowing Karen to commit deliberate intellectual property theft and breach her fiduciary obligations to the company's investors felt far worse than disclosing the foundation my father had established. 5 days prior to the investor meeting, I made a firm decision. I resolved to attend the acquisition briefing on the 9th of October. I did not intend to create a public spectacle, shout accusations, or disrupt the proceedings unprofessionally. I simply intended to exercise my legal right as an unterminated senior account executive to sit quietly in the boardroom and observe the presentation. If the lead investor recognized me or questioned the documentation, I would present the unvarnished facts. If not, I would accept that fate had closed that chapter of my life. Through the shared planning files, I discovered that the lead partner heading the private equity evaluation team was Catherine Kowalski, a highly respected managing director who had been a trusted business partner of my late father for over 15 years. I had met Catherine only once, at my father's memorial service 3 years earlier, where she had spoken warmly of my father's integrity and mentioned how frequently he discussed my dedication to mastering corporate operations from the ground up. I knew Catherine was an exacting professional who possessed an extraordinary eye for operational detail and financial truth. She was not someone who could be easily deceived by superficial executive jargon or polished corporate slides. On the gray morning of October 9th, 26 days after Karen had declared my termination, I prepared for the meeting. I put on a tailored navy suit, took my briefcase containing my complete, time-stamped personal work logs from the past 5 years, and arrived at Apex Group's corporate headquarters at 8:30 in the morning. The building security guard nodded and swiped me through the turnstiles without hesitation, as my access badge remained fully valid in the security database. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and walked into the executive boardroom, where presentation materials and refreshments were being arranged. Karen Thornton was already in the room reviewing her speaker notes. When she looked up and saw me standing calmly near the rear row of seating, her expression instantly transformed into a mixture of utter disbelief, irritation, and mounting panic. She marched across the room and demanded to know why I had returned to the premises after being let go. I kept my voice entirely composed and professional, informing her that because no formal written termination notice or severance agreement had ever been executed by Human Resources, I remained legally employed as a senior account handler according to every internal corporate system. I added that as an active staff member assigned to the key client accounts being evaluated, I was fully entitled to attend the institutional briefing. Before Karen could respond or call security, CEO Julian Moss entered the boardroom alongside several senior executives and members of the private equity delegation. Julian Moss appeared noticeably anxious, fully aware that the outcome of this evaluation would determine whether Apex Group secured a multi-million-dollar buyout or faced severe financial stagnation. He barely spared a glance toward the back row where I had taken a seat, assuming I was merely an administrative staff member managing technical presentation equipment. Karen forced a strained professional smile, concealing her panic as she turned her attention to welcoming the incoming private equity delegates. At 9:05 in the morning, Catherine Kowalski entered the boardroom, accompanied by two senior financial analysts. She was dressed impeccably, holding a leather folder and conversing with Julian about quarterly revenue projections. Although she looked somewhat tired from her travel schedule, her sharp eyes scanned the room with the precise intensity my father had often praised. Catherine was renowned throughout the industry for her refusal to accept superficial summaries, always demanding granular, operational evidence before approving institutional investments. As the meeting commenced, Julian Moss delivered an opening overview regarding Apex Group's founding history, market positioning, and capital structure, mentioning that 35% of the company's historical equity had been established by early angel investors while he maintained 55% operational control. Julian then transferred the presentation to Karen Thornton, introducing her as the Director of Client Relations who had personally spearheaded the firm's account expansion over the preceding 5 years. Karen stepped up to the podium with supreme confidence, projecting an aura of effortless authority as she launched into her slides. She began detailing the strategic client retention frameworks, account recovery protocols, and expansion methodologies that had stabilized the firm's revenue. Every single analytical model she displayed on the large screen was an exact duplicate of the work product I had spent 85 hours compiling at her explicit request. She explained how these methodologies had successfully expanded Apex Group's active account portfolio from 15 to 118 major corporate clients, presenting each breakthrough as an original concept derived from her managerial leadership. I sat quietly in the back row, watching her present my years of labor as her personal achievement. She specifically brought up the turnaround of the Ashford Corporation account 4 years earlier, describing how the client had been on the verge of terminating their multi-million-dollar contract due to service failures under previous management. Karen claimed that she had personally intervened, designed a customized service framework, and rebuilt client trust through strategic executive oversight, ultimately transforming Ashford Corporation into our largest client advocate. Listening to her false narrative was a surreal experience. I clearly recalled the 14 grueling months I had dedicated to saving the Ashford Corporation account. I had personally driven 5 hours each way every 2 weeks to meet with their operational teams in person, sitting in their factory break rooms and auditing their supply chain requirements to resolve their grievances. I had missed my sister Maya's birthday celebration to resolve an emergency operational outage for Ashford, and I had taken technical support calls at 3 o'clock in the morning to ensure their systems ran without interruption. 14 months of relentless individual effort were now being summarized by Karen as a quick executive intervention she had executed from her desk. As Karen continued her monologue, I noticed Catherine Kowalski stop taking notes. Catherine leaned back in her leather chair, her sharp eyes fixed on Karen with a subtle expression of skepticism. She interrupted Karen mid-sentence, asking her to provide specific granular details regarding the week-by-week operational decisions that turned around the Ashford account, specifically inquiring about how the account handler had overcome the client's initial resistance regarding supply chain integration. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second, her composure wavering slightly before she offered a vague response filled with high-level buzzwords about strategic alignment and value proposition enhancement. Karen's response lacked any actual operational substance, revealing to an experienced evaluator that she had never personally executed the work she was describing. Catherine nodded slowly, choosing not to press further immediately. Instead, Catherine slowly scanned the boardroom, her gaze drifting past the front row of executive managers, past the middle rows of department heads, and finally landing directly on me in the rear row. I sat upright, meeting her gaze calmly without shifting or looking away. I saw recognition register in Catherine's eyes. Her eyebrows raised slightly as her expression shifted from professional detachment to absolute surprise. She leaned forward, staring at me for several seconds to confirm my identity. She then leaned toward the senior analyst, seated beside her, and whispered a brief instruction. The analyst glanced back at me with a surprised expression before nodding to Catherine. Karen was midway through, explaining another revenue chart when Catherine raised her hand, signaling an immediate halt to the presentation. Karen stopped speaking, looking surprised by the sudden interruption. Catherine did not look at Karen or Julian Moss. Instead, she pointed her index finger directly toward the back row, where I was sitting, and spoke in a clear, resonant voice that carried across the entire boardroom, requesting that I step forward to the front of the room. The entire boardroom fell into a sudden, heavy silence. The atmospheric shift was instantaneous as 29 employees, board members, and private equity representatives stopped moving and held their breath. Karen Thornton's face instantly drained of color, her artificial smile collapsing into visible terror. Julian Moss looked around in complete confusion, trying to comprehend why the lead investor was ignoring his presentation director to summon an obscure staff member from the back. Sarah Drake sat frozen in her seat, watching in utter shock. I stood up smoothly, adjusted my jacket, and walked down the central aisle toward the presentation area. Every footstep echoed against the quiet room. When I reached the front podium, Catherine Kowalski stood up from her chair and walked around the conference table until she was standing less than 2 feet away from me. She examined my face carefully, looking at my eyes and posture, before asking the pivotal question that altered the trajectory of the entire acquisition. She asked directly if I was George Vance's son, Nathan Vance. I gave a single firm nod and confirmed that George Vance was indeed my father. The statement caused an audible gasp to ripple through the boardroom, as Julian Moss froze in his chair and Karen Thornton gripped the edges of the podium to steady her trembling hands. Julian Moss stumbled out of his seat, his voice cracking with shock as he asserted that he had no knowledge whatsoever that George Vance had a son working within Apex Group. He stammered that George had never mentioned having family employed at the firm during his tenure as a major equity shareholder. Catherine turned her gaze toward Karen Thornton, asking with icy precision whether Karen was aware of my identity or my familial connection to the firm's co-founder. Karen opened her mouth, but no coherent words emerged for several seconds. She finally managed to stammer that she had no knowledge of my background, claiming that I had never disclosed my relationship to George Vance and that nobody in management was aware of any connection. Catherine looked at both of them with intense disdain. She reached into her leather briefcase and retrieved a well-worn, leather-bound journal with yellowed pages and cramped handwriting. I recognized it instantly. It was my late father's personal investment logbook, a volume he had carried continuously during the final decade of his life. I had searched for it after his passing 3 years ago, but had been unable to locate it among his estate papers. Catherine opened the journal to a tabbed section and explained to the assembled board that 2 weeks before George Vance passed away, he had entrusted this logbook to her custody. He had instructed her that if Apex Group ever underwent an institutional acquisition or major corporate restructuring, she was to open this journal and verify the operational contributions of his son. Catherine began reading aloud selected entries recorded in my father's handwriting, complete with precise dates and analytical observations. She read an entry from 4 years earlier, detailing how I had spent 14 months salvaging the Ashford Corporation account through bi-weekly travel and exhaustive supply chain auditing, explicitly noting that I was building client trust without ever invoking his name or equity standing. She read another entry from 3 years earlier, documenting how I had expanded 15 failing accounts into dozens of profitable corporate relationships, while noting with concern that Karen Thornton was routinely taking my raw operational reports and submitting them to executive leadership under her own name. My father had systematically tracked my career from a distance, obtaining internal performance data and recording every major commercial milestone I achieved. As Catherine read entry after entry, the atmosphere in the boardroom turned completely toxic for executive management. My father's handwritten logs provided undeniable, contemporaneous evidence of my 5 years of labor, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that every strategic framework Karen had just presented as her own leadership masterwork was entirely engineered by me. Julian Moss sat paralyzed in his seat, looking at the journal, then at Karen, and finally at me with profound embarrassment and dread. Karen stood behind the podium completely rigid, unable to formulate a defense as her elaborate deception crumbled in front of the firm's primary financial suitors. When Catherine finished reading the designated entries, she closed the journal with a firm snap and placed it on the conference table. She looked directly at Julian Moss and stated that Karen Thornton's presentation constituted blatant intellectual property theft under federal copyright standards, severe misrepresentation of executive capability, and a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty to shareholders and potential acquirers alike. Catherine further highlighted that Karen's attempt to execute an undocumented, informal termination of a primary revenue generator without processing written notice or severance paperwork under labor statutes demonstrated appalling corporate governance and exposure to severe legal liability. One of the senior private equity analysts accompanying Catherine spoke up, stating flatly that the investment committee could not rely on any management metrics provided by Karen Thornton, as her entire operational presentation was built upon misappropriated work product. Julian Moss desperately attempted to mitigate the damage, offering frantic apologies to me and claiming that had he known I was George Vance's son, he would have ensured I received proper executive recognition and equity advancement years ago. I looked Julian in the eye and responded calmly that my father had intentionally kept my identity hidden precisely so I would be evaluated fairly on my actual performances rather than receiving unearned favors. Karen attempted a final, desperate defense, stammering that the client retention frameworks were collaborative team achievements developed under her overall departmental supervision. Catherine cut her off instantly with a cold, commanding look, stating that 30 years of corporate evaluation experience allowed her to easily distinguish between genuine executive leadership, deliberate professional theft. Catherine then turned to the entire room and announced the private equity firm's binding decision regarding the proposed acquisition of Apex Group. She stated that while the equity group remained interested in purchasing Apex Group due to its exceptional client retention metrics and solid underlying contracts, their acquisition terms had just undergone a radical, non-negotiable restructuring. She informed Julian Moss that the transaction would proceed only if executive control over client operations was immediately stripped from Karen Thornton and transferred entirely to me. Catherine declared that the investment group would create a new executive position, Vice President of Client Operations, and appoint me to head the department with absolute authority over all revenue strategies, account management protocols, and staff assignments. Furthermore, Catherine mandated that I would report directly to the private equity board of directors rather than to Julian Moss or local management, ensuring that no executive could ever again interfere with or misappropriate my operational work product. Julian Moss immediately agreed to every single condition, eager to salvage the multi-million-dollar buyout at any cost. Julian Moss hastily inquired about Karen Thornton's revised status within the restructured corporate hierarchy. Catherine Kowalski looked at Karen with absolute coldness and replied that Karen would not be terminated immediately, as that might disrupt ongoing operational audits during the transition period. Instead, Karen would remain employed as a junior administrative coordinator assigned to my department, reporting directly to me as her immediate supervisor. Catherine decreed that Karen would no longer possess any authority over client accounts, strategic planning, or staff direction, and that every single action, email, or proposal she wished to make would require my explicit written authorization. I observed Karen's face contort in profound humiliation. The woman who had publicly announced my departure 26 days earlier, attempting to erase 5 years of my life to claim a massive acquisition bonus, was now legally subordinated to the very man she had tried to destroy. She stood frozen behind the podium, completely powerless to contest the board's directive, knowing that protesting would result in immediate summary termination for cause and total loss of her financial standing. The formal acquisition process spans 75 days of rigorous legal restructuring, corporate auditing, and equity transfers. During this transition period, I officially assumed my role as Vice President of Client Operations. My new corner office on the top floor was 3 times the size of my former workspace, equipped with administrative support and direct oversight over 17 account managers and operational coordinators. Among those 17 subordinates was Karen Thornton. Every Friday afternoon, Karen was required to walk into my office for a mandatory operational review, bringing her weekly task logs and waiting quietly while I reviewed her work. Every strategy proposal she generated had to be submitted for my written approval, and I routinely corrected her missteps and rejected her superficial ideas with calm, uncompromising professional rigor. I never treated her with personal cruelty, raised my voice, or engaged in unprofessional taunting. I maintained an absolute standard of executive professionalism, expecting her to perform her assigned administrative duties efficiently. Yet, the daily reality of reporting to the man she had tried to erase proved to be an unbearable psychological penalty. 6 months into the new organizational structure, Karen walked into my office on a quiet Friday afternoon. Her former arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by deep physical and emotional exhaustion. She placed a single sheet of paper on my desk, a formal written letter of resignation giving 2 weeks' notice. She quietly stated that she could no longer continue working in an environment where every single day served as a reminder of her failed deception. I read her resignation letter, signed the acceptance line without hesitation, and wished her professional success in her future endeavors. I meant it sincerely, as I harbored no desire to see her suffer indefinitely. She had learned an unforgettable lesson regarding the severe consequences of intellectual property theft and executive arrogance. And her departure allowed my department to move forward without lingering tension. Following her resignation, I implemented comprehensive operational reforms across our client management division. I deployed expanded account retention frameworks, introduced digitized client feedback protocols, and led our expansion into 3 new regional markets that the previous management had neglected. Over the subsequent 18 months, our team increased Apex Group's total enterprise value 4-fold, turning the firm into one of the most profitable client management consultancies in the region. The private equity board expressed immense satisfaction with our financial results, and Catherine Kowalski noted during a quarterly board meeting that my father would have been extraordinarily proud to witness the height of my commercial achievements. However, despite the immense professional success, financial rewards, and executive authority I achieved, I frequently reflect on the ethical complexity of how the outcome was realized. I had given my late father a solemn personal promise that I would earn every promotion entirely on my own merit, without ever revealing his 35% equity stake or relying on his corporate legacy. For 4 years, I kept that vow faithfully, working quietly in the background through grief and personal hardship. Yet, on that October morning, I allowed Catherine Kowalski to expose his handwritten journal and leverage his equity reputation to dismantle Karen's deception and secure my executive position. I often ask myself whether I truly upheld my father's mandate or whether I ultimately relied on his posthumous protection to claim what was rightfully mine. I reassure myself that my 5 years of unassisted labor had already proven my operational capability beyond question, and that my father's logbook merely served as an objective legal record of facts that were already true. Yet, a quiet voice within me acknowledges that without his written intervention and Catherine's loyalty to his memory, Karen Thornton might have successfully stolen my life's work while the board looked the other way. That moral ambiguity remains a permanent aspect of my victory. It reminds me that corporate justice rarely arrives with absolute moral purity, and that reclaiming one's life work often requires accepting a complex personal cost. When colleagues ask whether I achieved total retribution against management, I answer that justice was served. But when I sit alone in my executive office, looking at the framed photograph of my father on my desk, I recognize that the true victory was not degrading a deceptive manager, but honoring the quiet dedication my father had documented before he passed away. I am deeply grateful to everyone who listened to my story. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know which city and country you are tuning in from, and subscribe for more real-world accounts of professional resilience and corporate truth.